Afternoon, everyone. Again, thank you for joining me again. I want to ask a question that you should feel no pressure to answer one way or the other. But I want to ask, and Morty will put up a poll, whether people would be interested, potentially, if we don't finish in a final session tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern. That would be short, probably like 45 minutes or so. There is zero pressure here. I just want to know whether I should fly like a nut today or give some room. Hi, Nancy Dubler. I'm so happy to see you on my screen. Okay, so with that, let me turn to chapter 3, verse 11. And Morty, you can share the screen as soon as you're ready.
Mm-hmm.
So, actually, I need a reader. I realized I need a volunteer to read. Who's game to read? Rabbi Mark Bisman, are you game to read?
Yes, sir.
You are tzaddik. Thank you.
You'll have to you'll address that question that I typed in at the end, please, or send me a note.
Okay, I don't think I saw it yet, but I will look.
You don't have to see it. I just will communicate. Okay.
Okay.
I'm ready to go. Read.
Go for it. Verse 11.
Okay. Biata biti alteri kol asher tomri selach ki odea kol sha'arami ki eshet chayil at.
Okay, so here I just want to note yet again that Boaz says words that are associated with God, right? These are words often spoken by God and God's prophets. That is, al tira, al tiru. See, for example, Genesis 26, Deuteronomy chapter 1. So again, I wonder whether what's being intimated here is a kind of divine role for Boaz. Interestingly here, Naomi had instructed Ruth to do whatever Boaz said, but now, instead of that happening, Boaz promises Ruth to do whatever she said. And here's that kind of gender subversion again, where this great, powerful Gibor Chayil man is saying, I will take my directions from you, young, poor Moabite outsider woman. So something very interesting is going on there. Now, one of the things that I think this text is implying, and I think the theology of this is worth thinking about, is that her good reputation somehow helps overcome the scar, the taint of being a Moabite. Somehow being known for Hesed becomes more important, maybe you could even say trumps genealogy. I think there's something there that is really interesting. And potentially is a critique of Ezra and Nehemiah, as we've talked about a couple of times. Now, in saying that she is an Eshet Chayil, he implicitly states, maybe unconsciously, but at least implicitly, that she is a match for himself. Since, after all, in chapter 2, verse 1, we saw that he was a Gibor Chayil. So Gibor Chayil and Eshet Chayil go together. I also would just note that the combination of the phrase Eshet Chayil with the word sha'ar does seem to draw us to Proverbs 31. Noda ba'sha'arim ba'ala. Her husband is known in the gates. I do wonder whether this is supposed to directly lead us to assume that Ruth is being held up as the Eshet Chayil picture of as presented in Psalm 30 in Proverbs 31. Okay? Okay, let's do verse 12.
Viata ki omnam ki im goel anochi v'gam yesh goel karov mimeni. Question mark on im.
So one thing I just want to notice here is potentially a connection to the patriarchs again and their narrative. No sooner does a promise emerge that an obstacle emerges to get in its way. I'll do whatever you say, except here's a challenge. There's another guy who's ahead of me. And I think one of the things that theologically you could argue, I know this will sound very pious, but I think it may be part of what's going on under the story, is that God makes do on God's promises in spite of hardships and obstacles that arise, something like that. There's some of that, I think, potentially going on here. That may be, frankly, an overreading. I'm not sure, but I think it's at least worth considering. Okay, let's read verse 13. We're flying here like crazy.
Lini halayla v'hayaba boker im yigalech tov yigal v'im lo yachpotz ga'alech uga'altich anochi chai Adonai shechvi ad haboker.
Okay, great. So first of all, it isn't totally clear, at least not to me, why exactly he wants her to stay the night. Is he protecting her physically or reputationally? Or some combination of the two? Not totally sure. In any case, it may very well indicate that he is doing what she asked, which is taking her under his wing and protecting her. Now, Lini, I think it's interesting here. I don't know what this means, but Lini is the same word, Lini halayla, sleep here tonight, is the same word that Ruth had used to promise Naomi that she would never leave her. Ba'asher talini alin. It's almost like, I mean, I don't think this is right, so I'm going to regret saying this, but it's almost like Boaz now wants to make sure that Ruth is also his and not only Naomi's. Something like that. That she has enough loyalty in her to be loyal both to her mother-in-law and to this man who is, I am tend to think, smitten with her, but at minimum committed to protecting her. I also wonder whether Lini halayla, when it associates us, when it creates an association in us to I will stay with you wherever you sleep, whether he's implying some kind of permanence in his relationship with her. This may all be overreading on my part, but I wonder what, because I think the Lini halayla, that can't be a coincidence. My interpretation may be over-interpreting, but I think that it's significant, is hard to avoid. Now, I think this is the rabbis at their kind of most hilarious. Some of the rabbis think that Tov was the name of the other guy. Im yigalech Tov yigal. Let the guy's name is Tov. That is, as they say, not the pshat of what's going on here. Now, does he want to marry her at this point? Seems like he does, but I guess we could debate about that. Tamar Ashkenazi, for example, is skeptical that that's what he's saying here. Now, here's the best case for the idea that this is a levirate marriage, even though it would operate under different laws of levirate marriage, yibum, than we have. That is that the phrase "v'im lo yachpotz" appears only one other time in the Hebrew Bible as a reference to chalitza, to the refusal of yibum in Deuteronomy 25. That's interesting. Now, not every time that a phrase appeared twice in Tanakh are they talking to each other, but often they are. So there, I think it's interesting to wonder again whether there's some other notion of levirate marriage that is afloat in this text. That is, some other construction of exactly who is obligated in yibum and by extension on chalitza. Now, also, it's interesting that his eagerness veers off into over eagerness, because he could have said in Hebrew, "V'im lo yachpotz legoolech uga'altich." If he does not want to, I will. Uga'altich anochi is I will. Right? It's almost like he can't contain his urgency to do that. People understand what I just said? In other words, when you have anochi, when it's not necessary, like for example, in biblical Hebrew, I mean, this is not a biblical Hebrew word, but if I say shamarti, it means I kept. If I say ani shamarti, it means I kept. The famous example of this in Chumash is Yaakov. Achen yesh Hashem b'makom hazeh, and not v'lo yadati, but v'anochi lo yadati. It was I who didn't know. So here, it's like if he doesn't, I will do it. You can imagine him raising his hand. I'm in. I'm happy to do it. Here's where I start to imagine again that he might be a little smitten. He very much wants to do this. Okay, let's turn to 15. Actually, you can read 14, but I'm going to say nothing about 14. Amazingly enough, I'm going to restrain myself. Go ahead.
Vatishkav margalotav ad haboker v'takam b'terem yakir ish et re'ehu v'yomer al yivada ki va'a ha'isha hagoren Vayomer Havi Hamit Pachat Asher Alayach Ve'echazi Vatochez Ba Vayamad Sheish Seorim Vayashet Aleha Vayavo Ha'ir. Sorry about that.
Yeah, so six barleys, literally, the 6 measures of barley. Now, if it's a se'ah, which is a third of an ephah, then it's 2 ephot, which is probably somewhere around 60 to 100 pounds of barley. And we get back into that superlative language, hyperbolic language that we talked about yesterday. Ellen Davis speculates that maybe this is such a vast quantity that maybe it's a bride price in her shawl, which would explain Naomi's startled question when Ruth arrives home, like, what is the status here? Oh my gosh, right? That kind of reaction. Okay, Vayavo Ha'ir, I just want to say, many amend that to Vatavo Ha'ir, which contextually fits much better. It is she who arrives at the city. We have this in many Hebrew manuscripts and the Pshita and the Vulgate, all kinds of, this is not like somebody's making this up as a modern. Boaz is coming to the city will be reported at the beginning of chapter 4 and might not make real sense here. Okay? Verse 16.
Vatavo el chamota, vatomer, mi'at biti, vatagela, 8 kol asher asala ha'ish.
Okay, so this is really quite interesting. Mi'at biti, JPS translates, how is it with you? More literally, you would translate, who are you? And I wonder whether mi'at biti is not, how is it with you, but what is the status that you currently are in as a result of your encounter with Boaz? Right? In other words, like, who are you? Are you engaged? Are you married? Are you what are you? I think is better than how goes it with you or something like that. Andre Lacoque, a contemporary Bible scholar, suggests here that these words of Naomi illustrate the ways that Ruth's identity is slippery and in constant transformation over the course of this book. That even someone who's the closest person in the world to her right now has to look at her and say, hey, who are you? Okay. Interestingly, by the way, Ruth does not give away at all that she had taken a much more active role in her encounter with Boaz than Naomi had instructed her to. Is it that she fears that it will come off as inappropriate? Is it that she is such a Baal Chesed that she wants Boaz to get the credit? Remember that a person who does Chesed does not call attention to themselves. Authentic Chesed doesn't call attention to themselves. So I leave that as a question for you, but I think it's kind of interesting, the lack of a report. Now here's what I find incredibly moving about her response. Let me just actually, I'm sorry, but I just lost my place. Forgive me for a second. Sorry, when Naomi asks Ruth, who are you? Ruth describes herself as a recipient of Chesed. There is something so incredibly moving about this. Here is a person who has done so much kindness, who has taken care of Naomi, who has shown initiative when it probably was enormously risky and dangerous. And then she's asked, who are you? And she says, I've been the recipient of great kindness. I'd like to go through the world like that. Okay, so I think there's just something really very beautiful about that. Let's go to verse 17.
Vatomer sheish hasarim ha'ela matanli, ki amar al tavoi rekam el chamotoich.
So this is really interesting because she seems to add words here that we at least have not heard Boaz say. Is it that she fabricates these words to reassure an anxious Naomi? Is that what's going on here? Is it that's how she interprets what Boaz is effectively saying and giving her all of that barley? Is it, are we supposed to read something as simple as he did say it, but the reader wasn't told until now? Is it Al-Sheikh, one of the great later medieval commentaries, has this wonderful comment where he says she wants to assure Naomi that her marrying Boaz will not cause her to forget Naomi. And she does that by saying, even Boaz is thinking of you, which is beautiful psychologically and almost, spiritually as a response. Okay. Now, notice also, because I think this is kind of gorgeous, that he says to her, Al tavoi reikam, which is the word that Naomi had used, reikam heshivani Hashem. I don't know exactly what it means, other than that it represents a kind of inversion. Naomi described herself as empty, and now she's being told, I would never come to you empty-handed. You're going to have stuff. You're not without resources or means, etc. Okay? Now, Ruth signals that the time of fullness has come by using that word, rekam, which Naomi had used to describe herself. In other words, it's almost like you imagine in 121, Naomi says, I am rekam, and then fully 2 chapters later, if we're paying attention, we hear Ruth coming and saying, you're not empty at all, or perhaps you're not empty anymore. Okay? Interestingly, in my notes, this is not my own insight, but in my notes, I messed up here. And I don't know where I got this. I have to look. I have to do some poking around. It's striking that Al tavoi rekam el chamotech, your mother-in-law, is the last word we ever hear Ruth say. Right? It's like the perfect encapsulation of the dedication and love that she has shown Naomi over the course of her life. Okay, let's just read verse 18 to wrap up the chapter.
Atomer shvi viti ad asher tate. I can't see the word. Tadin or tadin?
Tadin.
Ad tadin asher tadin ech yipol davar kilo yishkot haish ki im kila hadavar hayom. Better text here.
Okay, so what I think is actually really interesting here, first of all, I'll just anticipate chapter 4. Chapter 4, verse 1 will begin with Boaz saying to this other guy, shave, and chapter 3 ends with Naomi saying to Ruth, shvi. I don't know what that means, but I think it's noticeable. What I think is striking here is this is the ultimate repudiation on Naomi's part of sending Ruth away. You stay right here. Right? You don't need to leave. You don't need to go away at all. And then Naomi very astutely, which will perfect lead into the next chapter, says, oh, I have a feeling that Boaz is going to take care of this very day. You won't have to wait very long. Okay? So that's the end of chapter 3. And now we move to chapter 4. Mark, are you game to still reading, or are you having trouble seeing?
I think my problem is the text is a little blurry, and I need to get a better Tanakh. Let's see if this will do it.
Okay, so one thing that Judy Fentress Williams points out about the relationship between chapter 1 and chapter 4 that I really like, I mean, it's very simple, and that's what makes it elegant. Chapter 1, Naomi wants to send Ruth away, and chapter 4, Boaz wants to take Ruth in. It's almost like it's come full circle. Okay. Now, what happens in this chapter that requires interpretation is that we move from the world of women, where we have been operating until now, to a world that is fundamentally a world of men. And, some feminist readers of this text have expressed, I don't know what the right word would be, some misgivings, I guess, about the way this text ends. Here we are now in public negotiations. The men are negotiating over the status of women. But I found interesting here Tamar Eskenazi's comment in the JPS Ruth commentary that actually, if you read more closely, what seems like a public world dominated by men is also a facade for the work of women behind the scenes. In many ways, the men are playing out, Boaz especially, a script he's been given by Ruth. So rather than women being puppets whose strings are pulled by men, the men in this moment are puppets whose string has been pulled by women. I think that that's interesting. I don't think it necessarily should be read as apologetics. I think it's an interesting way of thinking about what might be going on here. Now, what will happen in this chapter, and then Mark will hopefully be ready, is that the whole community witnesses and affirms Boaz's decision to marry Ruth. And again, I would say, please think about contrasting that with the law in Deuteronomy, for example, prohibiting the marriage of a Moabite, which again, parts of Chazal will say refers only to marrying a Moabite man, not a Moabite woman. But that seems to me to be based on the narrative of Ruth rather than an interpretation of the law itself. Okay, so Mark, are you game or should I call on someone else?
Yeah, I'm fine.
You're good. Okay, great. Let's do
Boaz Allah Hashar Vayeshev Sham V'hinei Hagoel Over Asher Diber Boaz Vayomer Surah Shva Po Ploni Almoni V'Yasar Vayeshev.
Okay, so Uvoaz Allah, Naomi was right. In other words, it's not Vaya'al Boaz and Boaz went up, but Uvoaz Allah, Boaz had gone. Naomi is right that Boaz feels a sense of urgency to get things done. Now, if you're doing a theological reading of this text, I think that the phrase V'hinei is really important. V'hinei, again, as I mentioned, I think yesterday, is maybe it was 2 days ago, is a focalizer. It you're supposed to sort of see from the perspective of the character in the story. But the V'hinei is sort of, to me, like Vayiker Mikre. I think that the reader is asked to wonder, is this just coincidence? Or is this the subtle hand of providence somehow working in the world? For whatever it's worth, that's how Ruth Rabbah understands it. Ruth Rabbah really beautifully understands this as, well, God sees that the characters in the story have done their appropriate work, so now God decides to do God's work. If you're interested in the study of Jewish mysticism, this would be an example of what Hasidic masters often talk about, how there is an itaruta dilatata, a stirring from below, that elicits an itaruta dile'ela, a stirring above, that somehow they've done their part, so now God providentially tries to fix the rest of this situation. You do with that as you will. I think what makes this story so literarily powerful on a theological plane is precisely that you don't have to read it that way. It's still giving you space as a reader to sort of figure out and discern or not discern the presence of God in the story. Now, a couple of other things here. Surah Shvapo, first of all, Surah, as Eskenazi notes, it suggests diverting one's course from one's expected path. So he's telling this guy, go out of your way. Don't go how you've been planning on going. And Surah Shvapo is the statement of someone who has a lot of authority. You don't usually walk up to a stranger and say, don't go the way you're going, sit down. And what bolsters that is the repetition of those verbs in describing what the man does, Vayasar Vayeshev, right? The repetition of the exact same verbs underscores just how obedient he is to Boaz's words. And we'll see that again in chapter 2. He'll say, Shvu po, in verse 2, Shvu po, he says to the elders, sit here, Vayeshvu. And they do just as they're told. This guy is a force to be reckoned with. He's obviously someone who carries great stature. Now, there is a lot of literature, traditional and modern, about why this fellow is referred to as Ploni Almoni. It's not clear exactly why he's anonymous here. Chazal, as a rule, and some modern scholars as well, like Robert Hubbard, argue that this is midah keneged midah, poetic justice. The one who refuses to preserve the name of a kin deserves to have his own name vanish, something like that. Ellen Davis offers a softer version of this, which is to say, in refusing the role of the Redeemer, he effectively drops out of history, both the family history and the history of Israel. And so he renders himself nameless. In other words, it's not punitive so much as the consequence of what he does. Some modern scholars see the rhyming name as almost mocking Ploni Almoni, like Jiminy Miminy or whatever. It's a kind of like a sing-song mockery. I have to say, I'm still not totally convinced by all this, in that I wonder whether he really does anything wrong in this story. I am inclined, even though I could be convinced, I am inclined to read him as parallel to Orpah. That just as Orpah being fine, actually is what elicits how wonderful Ruth is. This guy being fine is what elicits how wonderful Boaz is. You understand? In other words, what I mentioned the other day about when someone contrasts you, if I say Claudio Kaiserbluth, I mean, he looks amazing when compared to other guys who are on death row, right? Then you'd say, okay, well, that wasn't a big compliment. But if I say, here's a bunch of really solid people, but compared to them, Claudio is a tzaddik, the second one is in some ways more of a compliment. So I wonder whether he and Orpah are parallels to each other, but I'm not sure about this. Okay, let's read verse 2.
Vayikach asara nashim miziknei ha'ir vayomer shvu po v'yeshevu.
Now, it's interesting, by the way, Vayikach is clearly a dramatic statement of his authority. He took 10 guys, not just any guys, elders, and said, sit here. And they sat. Vayeshevu. By the way, according to the midrash, this is how Chazal learned that you need a minyan to make Sheva brachot. In case we're wanting to learn halacha from the book of Ruth, the fact that he takes 10 men to create this wedding ceremony is important. Now, Shvupo, I just want to say, is an awful lot of authority. He picks them out, he sits them down, and they do as they're told. Okay, now, before we go on, let me just say that the scene we are about to encounter is enormously confusing. And that is, at least in part, because we have here a kri uchtiv. A kri uchtiv is essentially, forgive me for those of you from this is old hat, aktiv is what is written, and kri is that we have a tradition of reading it differently. When my father passed away, now almost 40 years ago, one of the things he was working on was a project to show how often the ktivs were actually right, and they were based on Semitic roots that the rabbis had lost access to. That the text was even better preserved than tradition thought. In this case, it's very confusing because the ktiv is kaniti, I acquire, but the kri is kanita, you acquire. And so we have to figure out, is it that the unnamed Goel will marry Ruth or that Boaz will marry Ruth? We're going to see this in a minute. I'm sorry if I'm kind of jumping the gun. And it's also just not clear what the operative kind of halachic or Jewish legal traditions, halakha might be an anachronistic word, but Jewish legal traditions are governing this story. Is it that this story is ambiguous? Or is it that this story is actually totally clear, but we live so far away that we don't understand the law that's being played out here? Is that distinction clear? Give me a thumbs up if you understand that distinction. Okay, great. So, right? So good. So we'll see that in a minute. And then, of course, as I've already mentioned, the introduction of levirate marriage, seemingly, which is very odd, because in our Torah and its laws, levirate marriage simply doesn't apply in this circumstance. They're not brothers. She's not an Israelite. There's all kinds of reasons why levirate marriage wouldn't apply. But be that as it may, let's go on. Pasuk Gimel. Vayomer lagoel. Go ahead.
Vayomer lagoel chelkat hasadeh asher la'achinu le'elimelech mochra Naomi hashava mistei Moav.
Okay. Now, this is just like an odd development because we had been under the impression until now that Naomi was destitute. Hence Ruth gleaning. And now, all of a sudden, she has a field to which Elimelech's heirs would have had some right. Now, there's different ways to understand it. Perhaps Elimelech sold it, and now the issue is to try to buy it back, legal in some way. But then Ruth is introduced, and the attention to the land becomes more muted. This is all just a very odd scene. And any kind of reputable commentary, modern commentary they're going to read is going to say, on some level, I'm not sure I really understand what's happening here. Okay? Now, Ahinu is an interesting word. Okay? Ahinu le'elimelech. And I wonder whether the word Ahinu here is meant to make the issue of levirate marriage seem more relevant. He's not, in fact, their ach, but by calling him an ach, by calling him a brother, Yibum is brought into the picture. in some way. It's a very shrewd move. One thing I will say about Boaz in this book, he may be a tzaddik, but he's also cunning. He knows exactly what he's doing at all times, it seems like. Okay? Now, machra Naomi means she sold. Mochra Naomi would be she is selling. If mochra would make more sense if the sale hasn't happened yet. Machra would be something that you sometimes see in biblical Hebrew, using the past tense to describe something that's about to happen as a way of saying it's as good as done, right? She sold it. It's as good as sold. But so that's just a matter of you're going to make your choice grammatically between mochra, which is present, and machira, which would be past. Okay. Now, Hashava misdei Moav, I don't know exactly what to do with this, but it is seemingly a subtle hint of Ruth, who is described in chapter 2, verse 6 as Shava misdei Moav. There's something interesting there. Okay? Now, okay, let's read Pasuk Daled.
Vani amarti egle osnecha lemor k'nei neged hayoshvim v'neged ziknei ani im tigal gaal ve'im lo yigal hagida li ve'eda ki ein zulatcha ligol v'anochi acharecha v'yomer anochi egal.
Okay, there is a lot in this pasuk. So first, let me just say the word geula also confuses us here, because until now we've seen discussion of the redemption geula of Ruth. Now, all of a sudden, we see the redemption of the land. Now, what's clear is that I think from Boaz's perspective, the goal is to end up redeeming Ruth. But we now have this kind of like side piece here about the redemption of the land. It's also kind of odd that Gaal and Kana here do not have direct objects, which is just strange. K'nei neged hayoshvim. K'nei what? The woman, the land, the field. Gaal what? The woman, the field. Not totally clear. Now, there's a word play here that's lovely. Egle is a word play on Gaal. Biblical Hebrew loves this kind of stuff. Sound play and word play. Also, Judy Fentress Williams makes a nice observation that Egle, somehow the language of uncovering, reminds the reader, in case it's not fresh of mind, that uncovering and covering took place also on the threshing floor. That there was a covering, an uncovering followed by a covering there. Now, one of the things he seems to be saying is that what you're about to do is going to have legal consequences. He's not saying acquire this. He's saying acquire this in the presence of those seated here and the presence of the elders of my people. What happens now will matter. And also, Boaz is smart, as Eskenazi points out. He doesn't give the guy any time to think at all. What are you going to do? Huh? What are you going to do? Now, his own hopes are clear from the fact that he introduces the second possibility. He could have said, V'im lo yigal, or perhaps better, tigal, hagidali, tell me ve'eda ki ein zulatcha ligol. And then he says, Va'anochi acharecha, oh, and I'm next. That's a totally superfluous piece of information, unless he's excited about that possibility. Also notice that here he doesn't say im tigal tov gaal, but rather im tigal gaal. Now that the moment of truth has come, he doesn't think it would be so great for this guy to do the geula, because he wants to do the geula. Okay? Now let's turn to verse 5.
Vayomer Boaz, b'yom kanatcha hasadeh miyad Naomi ume'et Ruth haMoabiyah eshet hamet kanita lahakim shem hamet al nachlato. Okay, so you may notice that the Hebrew of this verse makes absolutely no sense. It's difficult to know where to punctuate it. It seems that ume'et should probably read v'gam et. That is to say, Vayomer Boaz, b'yom knotcha hasadeh miyad Naomi, on the day that you buy the field from Naomi, ve'et Ruth haMoaviyah eshet hamet kanita, you also will acquire Ruth, the wife of the dead man. Right? He's not buying any field from Ruth.
So I think that that's very likely needs to be amended, frankly. Now, what Boaz is doing here is introducing, he's throwing a wrench into the affair. So it seems like what he wants to do is to persuade the other man, it's probably not worth it. You probably don't want to do this. There again is Boaz's cunning. Again, as I've mentioned, the legal status here of exactly how this works and how the field and the woman go hand in hand is really not clear. Okay, now, Ruth is still a Moabite in the eyes of the community. That may also be a way that Boaz uses to convince this guy not to do it. It's not, oh, if you redeem the field, you have to marry this widow. You have to marry this Moabite. And we all know about Jews and Moabites, right? He is really, he is very shrewd in this scene. Okay. Now, this is what I was pointing to before. Is it Kaniti or Kanita? Is it Boaz or the other kinsman who would be acquired? And then just the legal question, on what basis would that acquisition take place? Now, the Kri, Kanita, is odd. Why should a kinsman have to marry Ruth in order to buy the land back for the family? Geula and Yibum are not the same thing. Okay, so the Kri is strange. Now, there are a lot of possibilities here, different understandings of levirate marriage, Boaz's attempt to extend moral responsibility, even though levirate marriage does not technically apply, nevertheless, the spirit of the law applies. Maybe it's a way of manipulating in order to justify his own desire to marry Ruth. It's all very unclear, I would just say. The Ktiv, I will acquire her, actually makes some interesting sense, which is the land will one day revert to my offspring, and therefore it will be a financial loss for you. Just know that if you buy this field, I'm going to marry Ruth, and this field will not end up part of your property. Okay? And I can line up academic scholars, if you're interested, who line up on the side of the Kri or the Ktiv. In any case, one thing that a Bible scholar named Kristen Nielsen points out that I think is sort of obvious once it's said, but is important, is that this is the ultimate repair and redemption of the Judah and Tamar story. The Judah and Tamar story is about how far a man will go not to fulfill the levirate laws. This story is about how far a man not obligated to fulfill them will go to fulfill them anyway. So Boaz is the repair of Yehudah in a very, very interesting way, I think. Okay? And once again, I think the reader is left to imagine, is this his being magnanimous and ethical? And or, notice the and possibility, and or has he fallen in love? Okay? So I think that that's important and worth thinking about. Now, here again, I would just go back to the earlier point I made about how I think perhaps this Goel, Ploni Almoni, is parallel to Orpah. Here we see Boaz going way beyond the call of duty, in contrast to a guy who was like willing to buy the field, but didn't want to, ruin his inheritance. Just as Orpah was willing to follow her mother-in-law until her mother-in-law pointed out, that's crazy. You don't need to do this. So again, I think that there's something interesting there. I again, to use anachronistic language, I think one way to read the Megillah is as a meditation on the relationship between din and lifni mishurat hadin, between doing what you're obligated to do and doing what chesed drives you to do, which is always more than a legal requirement. I think there's another Shavuot sermon for one of the many rabbis on this call. How does that translate in some very interesting and important ways? Okay, now I'll just belabor this point by saying the whole language of Geula in the context of marriage is just very odd, because Geula if I am not mistaken, I think I am not mistaken, I am not certain I'm not mistaken, nowhere else in Tanakh is about marrying someone, right? I just don't think Geula ever means that. Geula is about either land or avenging the death of a relative. It's just simply not. And by the way, the whole notion of Lakim Shem Hamet al Nachalato is ironic, given that when we have a genealogy at the end of this chapter, Machlon is nowhere to be seen. He's not even in the genealogy. So what great act of Yibum has taken place here? Which I think maybe the text winking at us and saying, yeah, Boaz wants to marry her because he loves her. Okay. Now, for whatever it's worth, I think this is interesting. Ellen Davis makes a very interesting observation about this whole scene. She says, if you're totally bewildered, like let's say you're in a class with Shai Held, and Shai Held basically makes this scene look completely impenetrable. What Ellen Davis says that's like a really interesting chap is, don't you see? That's exactly the effect Boaz was going for. Boaz wants everyone at the scene to be like, wait, what? What's happening here? And then he gets to do exactly what he wants. Because he's bewildered them by piling law upon law. Neither applies, both applies. How are they related to each other? Who is doing what? And the confusion of the scene allows him to step forward in all his gallantry and say, I'll do it. I think that that's interesting and worth thinking about. Okay, let's read Pasuk Vav.
Vayomer Hagoel lo uchal ligoli pen ashchit et nachalati gaal lecha ata et geulati ki lo uchal ligol.
Okay, now the irony is that he's called to Goel just now as he says lo uchal ligol, which is I think kind of just humor. Pen ashchit et nachalati. JPS translates lest I impair my own estate. Ashchit is stronger than impair. Lest I destroy or annihilate my own estate. Now he's horrified by the idea. Now let me also say Boaz's willingness to marry Ruth here is a kind. This is actually basically what I just said in the last verse, but I'll just say it again in another way. Boaz's willingness to marry Ruth is a kind of subversive sequel of Yehuda's unwillingness to provide a husband for Tamar. Yehuda did not fulfill his actual duties of levirate marriage, but Boaz, who has no obligations, chooses to do so anyway. Now, why does the Goel change his mind? If we want to understand this story, if Kanita in verse 5 is correct, he doesn't want to take care of another person in his household, or he doesn't want to marry a Moabite. If Kaniti is correct, then he realizes he will eventually lose his investment. So now, if it's that he doesn't want to marry a Moabite, the reason he doesn't say that out loud is because this very prominent man, Boaz, has just said, I'll marry her. So it would not be a great move interpersonally and politically to say, I'm not going to do this because it's usher to marry a Moabite. Well, Boaz just told you he's going to do it. So he may have to be subtle about why he doesn't do it. Zakovich, for example, Yair Zakovich basically says the Goel's words are opaque, or so Zakovich thinks, because he doesn't want to say explicitly, I'm not going to marry a Moabite. Okay? Okay, let's look at verse 7. Morty, got to
Go
ahead.
Bezot lefanim b'Yisrael al hagula b'al hatmura lekayem kol davar shalaf ish na'alo v'natan l'reyehu bezot hateuda b'Yisrael.
Great. Okay, so this sandal ritual, we know it in biblical law only in the context of chalitza, of a man who refuses to do levirate marriage. But here, it seems like the text is saying that the sandal ritual is used as a general means of a business transaction. I do not think that you are intended to conclude from this verse that this is yibum and chalitza. I think that that's an overreading. I think we're actually being told that what you associate with yibum and chalitza has a far greater spectrum of application. You could. I mean, some Bible scholars, some modern Bible scholars actually think, no, the point here is that it must be chalitza. But it just simply doesn't say that. L'kayim kol davar does not mean chalitza. Okay, do that with that as you will. Okay, verse 8.
Vayomer hagoel leBoaz, kanelach vayishlof na'alo.
Okay. Now, it's worth saying that the Talmud is not clear who pulled off his sandal. That's a Gemara in Bava Metzia. Is it that the Ploni Almoni or Boaz? Now, if it's similar to Yibum, then if I may speak Gemara language for a minute, it would be the Makne, that is the other Goel, who would be taking off his shoe, his sandal, and handing it to a Boaz, which I think is probably what's going on here. Okay, let's keep reading here. We are really flying here. Okay, pasuk 9.
Vayomer Boaz laskenim v'chol ha'am, edim atem hayom ki kaniti et kol asher leElimelech v'et kol asher lechilyon u'machlon miyad Naomi.
Now, just point out very quickly that v'chol ha'am and all of the people suggests that there's now a whole lot of people gathering, and this has become a public scene. Hayom, I think, is an important word here, which underscores his sense of urgency. I have not acquired her. I have acquired her today. I have not, right? I mean, there's a kind of like a ringing urgency here. Okay, verse 10.
V'gam et Ruth haMoavia eshet machlon kaniti li liisha lahakim shem hamet al nachlato v'lo yikaret shem hamet me'ima echav u'mishar mekomo edim atem hayom.
I just want to point out again, in light of this verse, that it's striking that in the genealogy we hear nothing about Machlon. It is just something quite subversive about that. Yes, I'm doing this l'kayem shem hamet. I am going to perpetuate the name of the man who died. Except the man who died will appear anywhere again in this story. Now, I want to point out, this may be Eskenazi, this is again poor note-taking on my part. The Gamet root, somebody translates Vagam here as not also, but, and crucially, I am also acquiring root. Kaniti li'isha, this is the only time in the Bible that the root kana for taking a woman in marriage appears. Usually you have lakach and sometimes nasa. So the rabbinic idiom is born here of liknot isha, to acquire a wife. We're not going to get into that in this context right now. Now, interestingly, Eskenazi makes the nice point. Why does he say here, why does he call her Ruth a Moabite? And she argues that it's essential for Boaz to say this here, because if he wants the community to fundamentally accept what he's doing, he has to acknowledge that he's engaging in a marriage here that is unusual and surprising, right? You can't hide that. And then strikingly, once they accept, she's never referred to as a Moabite again, right? Then she's in. Now, also, it's striking when he says that he wants to perpetuate the name of the dead. It's totally different than what he said to her, which is he wants to redeem her. She's his only concern. So in a way, he is deflecting any attacks on this marriage by saying, look, it's not like I want to marry her. I just have something here I have to do in order to perpetuate the name of the dead. Now, again, I just keep coming back to this point. I find this to be one of the most interesting things about this chapter, that never happens, at least not in the genealogy that we have here. Okay, let's go to verse 10 and verse 11.
Vayamru kol ha'am asher b'sha'ar v'hazkenim edim yitain Adonai et ha'isha.
Sorry, I just want to make sure you got that clear, right? Everyone there said, we are witnesses. Okay, and then they give him a bracha.
Yitain Adonai et ha'isha haba'a el betecha Karachel uchleah asher banu shtehem et Beit Yisrael v'asei chayil b'Ephrata u'krashem b'Beit Lachem.
Okay. Adim, the fact that they say it that way makes it sound like this actually is the moment of wedding, right? It's a kind of formulaic response. Yitain Hashem now appears twice. We'll see in a minute, and which seems to suggest that everything that follows will now be a blessing from God. We're going to get to that in a second. And now she's welcomed into the community. He told them she's a Moabite, and they say, let's go. Marriage is okay. Now, references to the matriarchs outside of Breshit are rare. Leah, if I am not mistaken, is mentioned outside of Breshit only here in all of Tanakh. Right? It's quite striking. Now, why this blessing? So here I want to mention, this is something that even modern scholars sometimes turn to, the Malbim's commentary on these psukim. The Malbim claims, first of all, beautifully, that Rachel and Leah both had idolatrous origins, and nevertheless, they were able to build the house of Israel. So similarly, Ruth, a worshiper of the Moabite Chemosh, can be a builder of the house of Israel. Also, Malbim says, David HaMelech defends himself by reminding the people that all of Israel is descended from a prohibited union. A man may not marry two sisters. That is against biblical law. Okay, now, why do we mention Rachel first? Well, one thing is, like Ruth, she had been married a long time and only then was blessed with children. That's one possibility, although the text never does say that Ruth is akara, barren, but still. Other possibilities, perhaps Boaz is already married, as Jacob was when he married Rachel. So that's a way of sort of acknowledging, may your second wife bring you blessing. Another possibility, here from Fentress Williams, mention of Rachel underscores that this marriage is about more than duty. Boaz loves her, just as Yaakov loved Rachel. And listing the younger sister first constitutes a kind of reversal of expectations. And clearly the marriage of a Moabite woman to a prominent man is a subversion of expectations. There's a lot of possibilities here for what's going on. Again, what I tried to answer is two questions. Why Rachel and Leah? And why Rachel before Leah? Kras Shem, JPS translates perpetuate your name. And I wonder if this is deliberately ambiguous. Whose name is he perpetuating? Machlon's, like he said, or his own, like he in fact does? I think that's Kras Shem is almost delicious in its ambiguity. Okay, verse 12.
Vayihi beitcha kaveit Peretz asher yalda Tamar leYehuda min hazera asher yitain Adonai lecha min hanara hazot.
Okay, now why are we mentioning Peretz here? Now, Peretz is the son of an illicit union and a failed levirate marriage. So maybe it's acknowledging the kind of illicit, or at least seemingly illicit nature of the marriage between Boaz and Ruth also. Eskenazi, in which I can't decide if this is darshanut or plausibly pshat. Eskenazi places a great deal of weight on how the word peretz means a breach, and that this marriage represents a breach in the wall separating Israel and Moab. Feels a little homiletical to me. But I'm not, and by the way, to the rabbis on this call, homiletical is not a bad word. It's just a contrast to pshat. I'm not saying that in a critical way. I'm just not sure that that's sustainable as a pshat. Okay. Now, the comparison of Ruth to Tamar, at least, is interesting. Like Tamar, Ruth takes the risk of being sexually aggressive in a culture that denies women that right, that prerogative. And she does so in order to secure her own future. Both of these women, in that sense, are subverting cultural assumptions about what's possible and acceptable for them to do. It's also, it's just striking that Boaz and Ruth both are descendants of incestuous unions. He from Tamar and Yehudah, she from Lot's daughters. Okay. Na'ara Hazot, I think, is just interesting. I just want to mention, referring to her as a young woman is especially important when we're talking about how she's going to give birth, right? She's not exactly a Na'ara anymore, but because I think Na'ara here probably means something like woman who's still of childbearing age. Okay, verse 13.
ויקח בועז את רות, ותהי לו אישה, ויבוא אליה, ויתן אדוני לה היריון, ותלד בן.
I don't have the time to do a whole thing about this, and I'm not even sure exactly what it would look like, but I do think Vayikach Boaz et Ruth vatehilo leisha is significant as saying marriage is not unilateral. It's actually on some level involves both parties. On the one hand, he does the taking, but on the other hand, she consents to being his wife. I think that there's something there that's interesting. And then God lets her conceive or gives her conception, fulfills the blessings in verse 11 about may God grant you children. Vayitain harayon is interesting. It's an expression in the Bible that appears only here. Makes me wonder whether she is again being raised to the level of a matriarch, where even though the phrase is not used, it's sort of God who intervenes to make the barren matriarchs pregnant. Okay, now this is the only mention in the book of God, the only explicit mention of the book in the book of God acting. We saw in chapter 1, verse 6, a hearsay about God acting. That is to say, Naomi had heard that God had given his people food. But here, God intervenes. Okay? Now, if you don't buy the hearsay, then you can say that chapter 1, God had acted to solve the national crisis, and now God acts to solve the personal crisis. Okay. Now, again, it's just striking, as we've talked about a lot already over the past few days, the reality that, as a rule, the acting of God in this book is through agency. And this is kind of an exception that proves the rule, if anything. Right? That here God does something and you're like, oh, wait, I haven't seen that language in this book. So I think that that's actually important. Now, in verse 14, I'm not even going to have you read it. I'm going to try to push ahead here and just bear with me for a few minutes because we might not even need to meet tomorrow. The blessings that Naomi gets now restore her back right to the center of the action. And also notice how warmly they are going to speak of Ruth in verse 15. We'll see that in a minute. Now, the Redeemer here, Vatomer Anashim el Naomi, Baruch Hashem asher lo hishpit lach goel hayom, lo hishpit lach goel, for you. The issue is not Elimelech's line. The issue is Naomi's well-being. The goel here is doing something totally different than ensuring the line of a man. He's ensuring the health and safety and well-being of a woman. It's a total reimagination of what a goel does, I think. Interestingly, also, it is the son who is her redeemer because... Actually, let me leave that. Now, also, the Karei Shmo b'Yisrael is interesting, right? This means that their blessings go beyond the local, and the newborn has importance for the national story as a whole. Although, strikingly, we know nothing about Boaz and Oved apart from this book, but of David HaMelech we do know, obviously. Okay, verse 15. So the Tribble here famously notes, Eskenazi and others quote her, that the joy here is not just about the birth of a male son, but rather about the love between women. He is born of your daughter-in-law who loves you. The only use of the root ahav, of ahav in this book, your daughter-in-law who loves you, and she is better to you than 7 sons. Now, remember the phrase Heshivani Rekam, Rekam Heshivani Hashem? God brought me back empty-handed. As Lois Dubin notes, Meshiv Nefesh is a kind of refutation of that, or a response to that, right? You did return empty, but now life has been returned to you. Okay? There again, by the way, Lahashiv Nefesh is a term used only of God elsewhere. Nafshi Yeshovev in Psalm 23. This time, right, it's the baby who is now functioning in a role that God would normally have. Tribble has a great line about this verse, L'chalkel et sevateich, to sustain you in your old age. I'll quote it. The townswomen are concerned with the welfare of living women, not with the names of deceased men. A rather pungent formulation. And again, as I've said, they redefine the meaning of a goel as someone who will care for Naomi rather than someone who will perpetuate the name of the dead. Interestingly, Ruth and not Boaz is credited with producing this child. I'm not sure how common that is. I need to think about that more. Now, 7 sons, according to the book of Job, is the ideal family. These women are now saying Ruth is even better for you than an ideal family, right? This is like a total subversion of the idea that, like, oh, you know what you need in order to be a woman who's safe in the world? Men. Here, it's almost like they're saying, you have Ruth, that's better than a whole lot of men. Okay? Okay, now, Vatikach Naomi et hayeled, I think is an incredibly moving contrast to Vatishaer ha'isha mishnei yeladeha. She was left bereft of her 2 children, and now she takes the child into her arms, almost as a healing of the loss that she has endured. I don't know if healing is the right word for the loss of a child, but you understand, I think, what I'm trying to get at. Okay, now, interestingly, they say a son is born to Naomi, but there is no bloodline here. The neighbors, in a way, bestow upon Naomi the status of being the mother here. The phrase Yulad Benle applies to a woman only here in the Hebrew Bible, if I'm not mistaken. Usually that's a phrase that you would use only for a man. Now, some people, some scholars see here the idea that Ruth is being shunted aside, and so the Moabite origins of David are being covered up. Eskenazi rejects this in an interesting way and basically says these women are not negating Ruth's role so much as extending the child's connection to Naomi as a way of healing what Naomi has suffered. Okay? So I think that that's interesting. Now, it's also striking that this verse places a woman, Naomi, at the head of the royal lineage of David. That is not something to be taken for granted, I think. Now, I just want to say very quickly about the last few verses here, which we don't need to read exactly. We have here a genealogy. Feminists have long struggled with this genealogy because the question, of course, they ask is, does it erase women, ironically, given that the book has been so focused on women and their agency? Eskenazi, again, and you can sort of notice her particular feminist methodology of reading here, says from another perspective, given what we've learned about women's active roles, the very listing of a group of patriarchs can't be read in the same way, right? Because this whole list of patriarchs would not be in existence without the courage, fortitude, action, commitment, chesed of a group of women. I think that there is a lot to say. I hope one day to have more to say about it, about how the king of Israel is derived first and foremost from an act of Hesed. That there's something about that that is just enormously, it's like fundamental to biblical theology in some way and really worth thinking about. I will also just say, for those of you interested in historical critical readings of the Bible, that there is a long tradition of academics assuming that these verses are a later addition because they don't fit, not least because you don't have any mention of machlon. But I'm not really sure that that is very convincing. I think what you have at the end of this book, and here Eskenazi and others I think are quite astute, is a reversal of the prologue of the book. In the prologue of the book, lots of men die, and at the end of the book, lots of men are born. And somehow that's a healing. We've moved over the course of this book from death to life. Okay. Now, the last thing I want to say here, and this goes back to the question that has been asked a couple times by people about polemic, is that one wonders, I think one cannot help but wonder, whether the connection to David is part of an argument against Ezra and Nehemiah. Oh, you think we can't allow foreign wives? Foreign wives are responsible for the king of Israel. That is a kind of polemical thrust in the battle in ancient Judah about exactly what should be the relationship to wives of non-Israelite origin. Okay. Interestingly, David's Moabite origins, though, are not mentioned anywhere else in Tanakh, except perhaps, as someone mentioned the other day, that when Shaul persecutes him, his parents are taken in by the king of Moab. And one wonders what the relationship there might be. I want to just end with the following sentence. It is enormously striking to me that we read the book of Ruth on Shavuot, not least because I think it is meant to serve as a reminder that the giving of the Torah is meant to be the giving of a pathway to Chesed. As one of the Talmudic sages says, Torah tchilatag milur chasadim v'sofag milur chasadim. The beginning and end of Torah is Chesed, which is a way of saying Chesed is what Torah is for. So the fact that we read the book of Ruth on the day that we receive the Torah is just an enormously powerful reminder, or ought to be, about what Torah is for and what Torah is meant to culminate in. I'll take one question, and then we're going to call it a day, and we will not have class tomorrow. Let's see. I'm going to find one hand that goes up. Let's see if I can find any hands up. Better be good. I don't see any hands, though. Unbelievable. There are no questions. People are just completely blown away.
Just a reminder to raise your hand.
Oh,
I
Ronnie.
I see a hand.
I see Ronnie.
I see Nina Mogilnik.
Oh, okay. I saw Ronnie. I don't know how you pronounce your last name. I'm sorry. Sickle?
Yeah, which question?
Let's go with Ronnie first, since I...
Okay. Ronnie, I just asked you to unmute.
You've made the case that this is not a traditional Levirate marriage. So when we use the word goel here, maybe it's deliberately not following the rules of that, so that we look at the goel in a different way. So that I think that actually, I wrote it in I'm thinking that a goel is the person who drives chesed. So this geula is a different goel than the goel of the Levirate marriage.
Yeah, so I basically agree with that. I mean, it has a little bit of a kind of homiletical tinge to the way you're saying it.
Sorry,
but I think that that's probably basically right. That geula is being, let's say, expanded as a category, we think about Geula in different ways here. It's not just about a technical fulfillment. Remember how much of this book is about moving beyond technical fulfillment of legal obligation to something far more expansive. So I like the direction that you're going in.
Can I quote you? Chesed drives you to more than the legal requirement.
Yeah, I think
You said that
that's
to us a few minutes ago.
Yeah, I think that that's right. And I think, by the way, you see that very clearly, by the way, for example, in the Rambam's vision of what Chesed is, you know, that walking in God's ways equals, in some sense, lifni mishurat hadin, doing more than law requires. So yes, with you. Okay, why don't we just take one last question? Nina McGillnick.
Lev also has a question.
Who does?
Lev.
Lev Held?
Can I? Can I be quick?
Yeah.
I'll try to be quick. I don't want to oversimplify the complexity of what you shared with us, but I put in the chat earlier something, and I wonder what you think of it. I wonder if the entire story can't be thought of as kind of a meditation, a reflection on the notion of agency and love. The idea of human agency and choosing, coupled with the motivation of love, to be the kind of dual force that kind of changes not only the course of intimate relations, but the course of everything else that interacts with intimate relations, whether politics, nationhood, etc.
Yeah, so I think that that's beautiful and totally plausible. I, in general, am always hesitant about any sentence that says what the story about is X.
Mm-hmm.
But I certainly think you can say one of the things the story is about is exactly what you just said. It is certainly a meditation on the role of human agency in bringing redemptive outcomes about. That is for sure true. And it is about the way love can animate agency, right? Love gets us to do things we ourselves might not realize we're capable of doing. What a bracha that is to have moments in our life where we realize that. Sometimes it's in the midst of great tragedy.
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
But I think you're saying something that's very profound and very important. Lev Held, you can have the last word as long as it's brief. This is my 11-year-old Chavruta child. Go ahead, Lev.
So Ruth was a Moabite, and Moab and Israel were enemies. But it was even worse with Amalek. What do you think would have happened if Ruth was from Amalek? Do you think they would have treated her differently?
That's a very interesting question that I do not know how to answer. I do think that over time, the sages, the interpretive tradition, ends up effectively undermining the distancing of Amalek in the same way that it undermines the distancing of Moab, right? We effectively end up saying we don't know who Amalek is. But whether an Amalekite woman would have been treated the same way, I really don't know. That's a really interesting question. I mean, I don't know. What do you have to say about that, Lev?
I remember during one of your classes, like you said, love stranger, kill the Amalekite. But I think that I'm always hesitant about how much worse what Amalek did was than any other attack on the Jewish people.
Right. Yes. So okay. So we can't now in the interest of time get into a long discussion about why Amalek becomes considered the enemy of the people and the enemy of God. There's a lot to say there. I'm gonna leave that question for now, just because we're out of time. And I want to just take a minute to wish everyone a Chag Sameach and invite everyone to spend some time on Shavuot asking yourself how the receiving of Torah and the growth in Chesed can go together, how one can facilitate the other, and how the latter can even be a test of the former. Whether it's Torah that we've received in some sense depends on whether it makes us grow in Chesed. Thank you all so very much. Hope to see you again before too long.